This is week 5. Today we're going to talk about the kingdom Protista. And on the slide you see the vast array of different organisms that are included in the kingdom Protista. Kingdom Protista is actually divided into two kingdom Monera, in that all the organisms of this kingdom are eukaryotic as opposed to prokaryotic. In that way they all have membrane-bound organelles. There's an increase in complexity of function in this kingdom compared to Monera. And because of this increased complexity, and because the membrane-bound organelles exist, there's a requirement for interactions between these organelles which must occur. The two subkingdoms of kingdom Protista are Protozoa, which usually exist as individual cellular organisms that are heterotrophic, that is, they must eat their food, and mobile. And this is the example of the protozoans with the various ones shown on this slide, and we will go over this in more detail in the upcoming slides. The other subkingdom is algae, which exists usually as colonies, is autotrophic, that is, functions by photosynthesis to produce its own food, and floating particularly in water. And here's an example of one of the many types of algae that can be found. Now, when we talk about protozoa, we talk about differences in motility. And that is one of the ways in which the protozoa are divided up. And the first of these is called Sarcodina. And this is what we know as the amoeba. And they move by means of pseudopods, or false feet. And here's an example of an amoeba. I'm sure you've seen this in books in the past. The second phylum in the subkingdom Protozoa is called the Metagophora. This group moves by means of a single whip-like structure known as a flagellum. The standard organism that is most commonly used as an example of this is the Euglena. And here's an example of the Euglena. We will again talk about this in more detail in future slides. The third phylum of the subkingdom Protozoa is called Sporozoa. These do not move at all, and an example of this is Plasmodium. Plasmodium vivax is one of the causes of malaria, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. And here's an example of the Plasmodium. And then lastly, there's the Ciliophora. Ciliophora move by means of cilia, which are short hair-like projections from the membrane that beat in a rhythmic fashion in order to cause motion. And the example. So looking more in depth at the Sarcodina, or amoeba, we see that they move by means of projections from their membrane, which appear like feet but are not true feet, therefore the name pseudopod. It's a foot-like extension from the cell that is used for two purposes actually. One is to allow for motion, the other is to engulf food. A second structure within the cell, which we can see one of these right here, is a food vacuole. Once the pseudopods surround food, it's taken into the amoeba, and eventually the pseudopods become a internal structure that has the food within, and this is known as a food vacuole. Another type of vacuole is shown here, and this regulates water within the cell and is called the contractile vacuole. Within the cell is a thin watery cytoplasm that is generally near the membrane on the inside. It's called the ectoplasm. And this is as opposed to the endoplasm, which is a more dense centrally located material that's on the interior of the cell. And so this is the arrangement of the organelles within the amoeba. Now this shows the life cycle of one of many types of amoeba. This is Entamoeba histolytica. And Entamoeba histolytica, one of its significant abilities is it will form cysts. And this is just one of those types of cysts that can form. And the purpose of the cyst is to survive hostile environments. So when the amoeba senses that it's within an environment that it's going to have difficulty surviving, it will form a cyst, which acts as a protective structure that allows the amoeba to survive. And then once the environment improves, then the cyst will break open and out will come viable amoeba. The reason that the cysts are so important is that in order to eradicate an amoebic infection, or in order to make sure that amoeba are taken care of, you have to make sure that you destroy all the cysts. You cannot just kill the live amoeba. Entamoeba histolytica, as I said before, is a amoeba that principally dwells within the gut. When it does, it can actually cause disease. And two diseases that are associated with this type of amoeba are colitis and a amoebic abscess, liver abscess. Now this slide shows the euglena, and the euglena is characterized by this long whip-like structure known as a flagellum, which is responsible for the ability of this to move. Now the euglena also has an outer membrane or coating called the pellicle. The purpose of the pellicle is to give this organism some shape. The amoeba has no real defined shape and will move. When it moves, its shape's continually changing. Unlike the amoeba, the euglena, because of this pellicle that's around the outside of the cell, it retains a fairly constant shape. Now euglena actually live by photosynthesis. They're one of the few protozoans that are autotrophs, and the chlorophyll is contained in these structures called chloroplasts. And photosynthesis occurs here and provides energy for the entire cell. Now the euglena also has an area right here called the eye spot or stigma. The eye spot is a light-sensitive region that allows the euglena to position itself in an area where there is light. And obviously an organism that produces by photosynthesis its own energy has to be able to migrate toward the light and find areas where light is plentiful. This is another organism in this Metagospora or flagella, and here on this one is the flagella. And the reason that I bring this organism up is it's an example of something known as symbiosis. Now this organism actually lives within the body of the termite, and this organism is what allows the termite to digest wood. If this organism was not present in the body of the termite, then the termite would not be able to ingest and digest wood. And symbiosis is a term that means that there's a close relationship between two or more species, and at least one of those species benefits from that association. Now there are different kinds of symbiosis. The first is called mutualism. Mutualism is when two or more organisms are associated with each other and all of the organisms in the relationship benefit in some manner. The second is called commensalism. Commensalism is when there's a close relationship between two or more species and then one of those species benefits and the others are unaffected in any way. The last is parasitism, And you probably have heard of parasites before. That's when there's two or more species associated with each other. One of those species benefits, but the other species does not, and is actually harmed by the association. Actually, this association of this organism with the termite is one of mutualism, because the organism benefits and the termite also benefits from that association. Protozoans are called the Ciliophora, and the example is the Paramecium. The Ciliophora are characterized by the presence of cilia. The arrow here points toward the cilia, which are hair-like projections that come from the cell wall or cell membrane, and they allow for the organism to move. They also allow, in this area, they allow us with a sweeping motion to sweep food into this area right here, which we're going to talk about in just a second. This is what's known as the macronucleus. The macronucleus is the nucleus that's necessary for controlling metabolism. This organism actually has two nuclei. The other is right here, and it's called the micronucleus. The micronucleus is responsible for controlling reproduction. The macronucleus is responsible for controlling metabolism. And then here we have the area where food is taken in. This is called the oral groove, and it's actually cilial movement that allows the sweeping of food into this area. This is the oral gullet and then the oral pore here. Once food is swept in, it's swept into this area, which is called the oral gullet. The gullet collects the food that is swept in through the oral groove. Once this is filled that no more food can be taken in, it then pinches off and forms a vacuole, a food vacuole. The end of the paramecium is actually what is known as the anal pore. And after the food is digested, whatever's left as undigested food is expelled out this side of the organism through the anal pore. So the undigested food is then taken out and expelled. And then we have this very interesting looking structure right here. It's this central area with these ray-like fanning out from the center. And this is also called a contractile vacuole. Remember, there was a contractile vacuole in the amoeba. And this contractile vacuole also controls water balance. And in a live situation, you can see there are actually two here. In a live situation, you'll see this actually contract, and water will be dispelled out from the cell. Now, paramecia can divide asexually by binary fission, but they can also connect with each other and exchange DNA, and that connection is called conjugation. The last of the protozoans that we'll talk about are the protozoans that have no natural motion of their own. And this is called the sporozoa. The example is Plasmodium. And sporozoa reproduce by means of something called a spore. The spore is a hard reproductive coating around a reproductive cell. And what you can see here is the spores are injected into the host by means of the mosquito, in which point they enter and move through the animal. Plasmodium causes malaria, and in the next slide I'll show you exactly how that happens. The interesting thing is something that we see in several different species and several different animals, and that is something called alternation of generation. Alternation of generation is a situation where the life cycle is an alternation between the spores and other forms of reproduction. You can see here there are gametes, female and male gametes. That's one form of reproduction. And then up here you can see the spores, and that's another form of reproduction. So you have one generation will be by spores, another generation will be by gametes, and back and forth like that. The second major subkingdom in the kingdom Protista is the algae. Algae are frequently called in a colloquial way plankton, but plankton as a term simply means tiny organisms that float in the water. They are not always algae. Not all plankton is algae. And in fact, zooplankton is floating organisms that are generally animals or protozoans, whereas, and this is example of those zooplankton. Phytoplankton, on the other hand, are tiny floating organisms that perform photosynthesis, and these are much more commonly what we associate with algae. Algae has a body that looks like a plant, looks like it has leaves, roots, and stems many times, but indeed the body itself is known as a thallus. This is the plant-like structure, but it does not have definitive leaves, roots, or stems. And this is an example of some various types of thallus-like structures. And these, some people might try to call this the root and this the stem and these are the leaf areas, but that would be incorrect. And you should not refer to these as leaves, roots, or stems. And we'll talk about leaves, roots, and stems when we talk about plants. Algae can bloom, can rapidly reproduce, and do what's known as an algal bloom. And that's this picture over here is an example of an algal bloom. What happens is the algae can reproduce so rapidly that it takes over this entire habitat, consumes all the available oxygen, and results in the death of other animals and plants in this area. And this is a fish that has died because of a algal bloom and the associated destruction or consumption of the available resources. Now, algae are separated into many different phyla, and most of these phyla are based on the color of the algae. The first of these is called chlorophyta, or green algae. Chlorophyta are very much like regular plants that we think about every day. They have a substance in their cell wall which is called cellulose, which is responsible for a stiff, moderately inflexible motion of the cell. And they grow in very long stranding colonies like this, and they're called filaments. And so green algae are very much like the plants that we think about. The green algae perform photosynthesis. They have cellulose in their cell walls, and they grow in colonies called filaments. Chrysophyta is the second phylum. Chrysophyta is characterized by a group of organisms called diatoms. Diatoms are the members of this group, and they're called Chrysophyta because they have silicon dioxide in their cell wall. The silicon dioxide is the same material that we use to make glass. And so their cell wall is very much like tiny glass particles. And when these organisms die, they can accumulate together, their bodies can accumulate together after they die, and you have a huge mass of glass-like material, and this is called diatomaceous earth. Now, because of its structure, it actually is moderately abrasive, and this diatomaceous earth used to be harvested and sold as a means of polishing other materials, metals and jewels and things of that nature. The diatoms also frequently have a structure called a holdfast. And a holdfast is an anchor that the diatom can use to anchor itself to the ground or to a rock or some other stationary object. The third of these phyla of algae is called Pyrophyta. This is an example of Pyrophyta, and Pyrophyta commonly have two flagella, one here and one here, and for that reason they're called dinoflagellates, which means they have two flagella. And these tend to float as single colony members. In other words, they don't group in colonies, but they float individually. But they can release a substance into the water, and that substance, which is released into the water when they bloom, it causes something known as the red tide. And the red tide is very poisonous to other marine animals and can cause the death of thousands of fish when this occurs. Phaeophyta is something that we known as brown algae, and it is the largest algae in the groups of algae. It is characterized by large colonies that don't require a microscope to see it. The cell wall has a material called algin or alginistic acid, and this material comes from the wall and is used as a thickening agent in material like jello or agar plates that are used to grow organisms. This algae is what makes up what we call kelp or seaweed in the ocean. And as I said, this is the largest member in terms of the size of the individual plants in the subkingdom of algae. You see right here on these algae, these little pockets, these actually contain air. And this allows the algae to float in the water. And these are called air bladders and allows the algae, as I said, to float in the water.